The first gunshot that woke El Dorado, Colorado, that morning wasn't from a bandit's revolver, but from the single bullet Isaac Quinn fired into the sky after finding his younger brother cold in bed, the fever having taken him sometime in the night. The year was 1876, and death was as common as dust in these parts, but that didn't make the weight of it any easier to bear. The sound brought Cassidy Cooper running from the adjacent property, her chestnut hair whipping in the wind as she arrived at the Quinn homestead, breathless and wide-eyed. She found Isaac on his knees in the yard, clutching his brother's favorite hat, his face hollow with grief and 3 days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw. "Thomas is gone," was all he said, his voice cracking like dry kindling. Cassidy pressed a hand to her mouth, tears immediately springing to her eyes. She'd known Thomas Quinn all her life, had watched him grow from a scrappy boy to a fine young man of 22. Had warned Isaac just last week that the cough sounded worse, that the doctor from Denver should be summoned. "Isaac, I'm so sorry," she whispered, reaching for him. But the tall cowboy stood abruptly, his shoulders squared with the rigid posture of a man determined not to break. "Need to make arrangements," he muttered, striding past her toward the barn, his spurs jangling with each heavy step. Cassidy stood helplessly watching as he saddled his horse with mechanical precision, his movements sharp and angry. She knew better than to follow. Isaac Quinn had always been a mountain of a man, not just in his 6'3" frame, but in his stoic nature that seemed carved from the same rocky cliffs that surrounded El Dorado. At 31, he'd already weathered more than his share of hardship since coming west with Thomas after the war. The town turned out for the burial 3 days later. Thomas Quinn was laid to rest beside their parents in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley. Isaac stood rigid as a pine tree, accepting condolences with terse nods, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the mountains. When the last handful of dirt was thrown, he walked away alone, ignoring the offers of company and comfort meals. Cassidy watched him go, her heart aching. At 26, she'd known her share of loss, to her father to a mining accident 5 years prior, her mother to consumption the year after. She understood the numbness, the desire to disappear into oneself, but she also knew the danger of it. That night, she stood in her modest kitchen, stirring a pot of hearty beef and barley soup, Thomas's favorite. The recipe had been her mother's, passed down with the same care as her grandmother's china. Simple food with healing properties, her mother always said. Food that could mend more than an empty stomach. When darkness fell, Cassidy wrapped herself in a shawl and carried the covered pot across the field that separated their properties. The lamplight that usually burned in Isaac's front window was absent, the cabin dark and silent as a tomb. She hesitated at the door, then gently knocked. "Isaac." "I've brought some supper." No response came from within, though she was certain he was there. His horse was in the paddock, and smoke still curled from the chimney. "I'll just leave it here for you," she called, setting the pot near the door and placing a folded cloth over it. "It's Thomas's favorite. Was Thomas's favorite." She lingered a moment longer, hoping, but the door remained firmly shut. Cassidy returned to her own cabin and sat by the window, watching the distant shadow of Isaac's home until sleep claimed her. In the morning, she found her pot on her own doorstep, empty and scrubbed clean, but with no note or acknowledgement. The days lengthened into summer, and Isaac Quinn all but vanished from town life. The ranch hands reported he worked from sunrise until well after dark, pushing himself and them with grim determination. He no longer joined the Saturday gatherings at the saloon or Sunday services at the small white church. When supplies were needed, he sent one of the hands rather than make the trip to town himself. "He's trying to work himself to death," Oliver Jameson, the town doctor, remarked to Cassidy one afternoon as she collected medicines for old Mrs. Tillman. "Guilt's eating him alive." "Thinks he should have done more for Thomas." "There was nothing more he could have done," Cassidy protested. "That fever took 3 others this spring." "You know that, and I know that," the doctor said, but grief isn't reasonable, Miss Cooper. That evening, Cassidy made another pot of soup chicken and dumplings this time and once again made the journey across the field at dusk. The pot was returned the following morning just as before. Thus began a pattern. Every evening, Cassidy would prepare a meal and leave it at Isaac's door. Sometimes soup, sometimes stew, occasionally a fresh baked loaf of bread and preserves. Each morning, the dishes would appear on her porch, meticulously cleaned but without a word of thanks or acknowledgement. Weeks passed this way. Summer's heat scorched the land, turning the grass golden and the creek behind Cassidy's property to a lazy trickle. She continued her quiet mission, even when the heat made cooking an ordeal that left her dress damp with perspiration and her cheeks flushed. It was on one such sweltering evening in late July that she approached Isaac's cabin with a pot of cool cucumber soup and found him sitting on the porch steps, his hat tipped low over his eyes, a whittling knife and piece of wood in his hands. Cassidy nearly stumbled in surprise. "Oh. Good evening, Isaac." He didn't look up, but his hand stilled. "Miss Cooper." She hesitated, then stepped closer, holding out the pot. "I brought soup. It's cucumber served cold, good for a hot night like this." Isaac's knife resumed its steady scraping against the wood. "You don't need to keep doing this." "I know I don't need to," she replied softly. "Then why?" Cassidy considered her answer carefully. "Because Thomas would have wanted someone looking after you, and because I know what it's like to be alone with grief." He finally looked up then, his blue eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. The once clean lines of his face were now obscured by a full beard, and his skin was deeply tanned from long days in the sun. "I'm managing just fine," he said flatly. "Are you?" she challenged gently. "When's the last time you had a proper conversation with anyone?" Isaac's jaw tightened. "Don't need conversation to run cattle." "Maybe not," Cassidy conceded, "but you need it to stay human." Something flickered in his eyes, a spark of the man she'd known before tragedy struck. Then it was gone, extinguished like a match in a downpour. "Sun's setting, Miss Cooper. Not safe for a woman to be out alone." Cassidy set the pot down on the step beside him. "I've been making this walk every evening for nearly 2 months now, Isaac Quinn. I suspect I'll be just fine for the 5 minutes it takes me to get home." She turned and walked away, feeling his eyes on her back until she disappeared into the dusky light. The next morning, her pot was on the porch as usual, but beside it lay a small wooden carving of a meadowlark, its details so finely rendered she could almost hear it sing. August brought relentless heat that withered crops and tempers alike. Cassidy continued her nightly deliveries, though Isaac was never again on the porch to receive them. The wooden bird found a place of honor on her mantel, joined by a rabbit the following week, then a fox, each appearing silently with her return dishes. It was in the first week of September that everything changed. Cassidy had prepared a pot of venison stew, using meat from a deer one of the neighboring ranchers had shared with her. The evening was cooler than it had been, with a hint of autumn in the air that made her pull her shawl tighter as she made her way across the field. As she approached Isaac's cabin, she saw no lights within, which was unusual for this hour. Concern prickled at the back of her neck. She quickened her pace, nearly stumbling in her haste. The cabin door was ajar, something Isaac would never allow. Setting the pot down carefully, Cassidy called out, "Isaac, are you home?" No response came, but she heard a faint groan from within. Heart pounding, she pushed the door open wider and peered into the dimness. It took a moment for her eyes to adjust, but then she saw him, Isaac, sprawled on the floor near the cold fireplace, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. "Isaac," she gasped, rushing to his side. His face was ashen beneath his tan, his forehead beaded with sweat despite the cool air. "Broke it," he managed through gritted teeth. "Horse spooked, threw me against the rocks near the north pasture, crawled back." Cassidy's hands fluttered over him, assessing. "How long have you been lying here?" "Since morning." "Good Lord," she muttered, already moving to light the lamps and stoke the fire. "I need to get the doctor." Isaac's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. No, just help me to the bed, I'll be fine. You will not be fine, she snapped, her worry making her voice sharp. That leg needs setting properly, and who knows what other injuries you've got. I'm getting Dr. Jameson, and you'll just have to bear it. Something that might have been amusement flickered across Isaac's pain-tightened features. Bossy woman. Stubborn man, she countered, gently extricating herself from his grip. Now, I can't move you alone, you'll have to wait here while I fetch help. It took Cassidy less than 30 minutes to return with the doctor and two of the hands from the neighboring Marshall Ranch, but it felt like hours. They found Isaac semi-conscious, his skin clammy and his breathing shallow. Broken femur, Dr. Jameson pronounced after a careful examination. And a couple of cracked ribs, I'd wager. We need to get him on the bed before I can set this. Moving Isaac was an ordeal that left him unconscious and the rest of them perspiring despite the cool night air. Once he was settled, the doctor sent the ranch hands away and turned to Cassidy. I'll need your help, he said grimly. This won't be pretty. Cassidy nodded, rolling up her sleeves. She'd assisted the doctor before, most recently when young Billy Thornton had fallen from the livery roof and broken his arm, but this was different. This was Isaac. The sound of bone being pulled and set into place was something Cassidy knew would haunt her dreams, as would Isaac's strangled cry as he briefly regained consciousness during the worst of it. But she held steady, wiping his brow, offering sips of water and following the doctor's instructions to the letter. He's lucky, Dr. Jameson said when they'd finished, the splinted leg secure and Isaac resting under the influence of laudanum. If you hadn't come by when you did, Miss Cooper, the shock and exposure might have done what the fall couldn't. Will he heal? She asked, still clutching Isaac's limp hand. With proper care, yes, but he's looking at weeks of bed rest and it'll be months before he's back to full strength. The doctor packed his bag with a weary sigh. Someone will need to look after him. I will, Cassidy said without hesitation. Dr. Jameson studied her for a long moment. It won't be easy, he's not likely to be a cooperative patient. I'm well aware of Isaac Quinn's stubborn nature, doctor, she replied with a small smile. I can manage him. And so Cassidy Cooper moved temporarily into Isaac Quinn's cabin, setting up a pallet in the main room while he occupied the bedroom. The ranch hands, relieved to have someone taking charge, readily agreed to handle the daily operations under her direction, with frequent consultation with Isaac once he was lucid enough to give instructions. The first week was the hardest. Isaac drifted in and out of consciousness, fevered from the trauma and fighting the pain even through the haze of laudanum. Cassidy barely slept, constantly checking on him, coaxing water and broth between his cracked lips, changing the cool cloths on his forehead. In his delirium, he called for Thomas, begging forgiveness, making promises to a brother who could no longer hear them. Cassidy held his hand through the worst of it, her own tears falling silently as she witnessed the raw grief he'd kept so carefully contained. You did everything you could, she whispered to him one night as he thrashed in the grip of a nightmare. Thomas knew how much you loved him. He knew, Isaac. Whether it was her words or simple exhaustion, Isaac calmed after that, his sleep growing more peaceful. By the end of the week, the fever broke, and he woke fully lucid if confused to find Cassidy dozing in a chair beside his bed. Miss Cooper, he croaked, his voice rusty from disuse. Cassidy startled awake, nearly tipping the chair in her haste. Isaac, you're awake. Appears so, he said, wincing as he tried to shift position. Though I'm thinking unconsciousness had its advantages. Relief made her laugh despite herself. Well, at least your unpleasant disposition is intact. That's a good sign. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. How long have you been here? About a week, she answered, pouring him a glass of water from the pitcher by the bed. Dr. Jameson said you needed looking after and I volunteered. Isaac accepted the water with a slightly trembling hand, his gaze never leaving her face. You didn't have to do that. We've already established that I don't do things because I have to, she reminded him gently. Now, are you hungry? I've got soup ready. A genuine smile broke through then, transforming his haggard face. Of course you do. As September gave way to October, Isaac's condition steadily improved, though his patience with confinement did not. Cassidy found herself constantly battling his attempts to do more than his healing body was ready for. "If you tear those stitches one more time, Isaac Quinn, I swear I'll tie you to this bed," she threatened one afternoon after finding him attempting to dress himself. "I'd like to see you try," he retorted, though he dutifully lay back down. "Don't tempt me," she warned, but there was no real heat in her tone. These exchanges had become familiar, almost comfortable in the rhythms of their days together. Each morning, Cassidy would help Isaac to a chair on the porch, where he could breathe the fresh air and oversee some of the ranch work from a distance. She'd bring him his meals there, sitting beside him while they ate, filling the silence with news from town or observations about the changing season. At first, Isaac contributed little to these conversations, responding with nods or single-word answers. But gradually, as the golden aspen leaves began to fall and the mountains took on their first dusting of snow, he started to open up. He told her stories about growing up in Virginia, about the war that had taken so much from him, about the journey west with Thomas in search of a new beginning. And Cassidy shared her own stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, of her father's dreams that had brought them to Colorado, of the struggle to maintain the small homestead after her parents' deaths. "Why did you stay?" Isaac asked her one evening as they watched the sunset paint the western sky. "After they passed, you could have gone back east, found family." Cassidy considered the question, watching an eagle circle lazily above the pines. "This is home now," she said simply. "My parents are buried here. Their dreams are in this soil." She glanced at him. "Besides, who else would bring you soup every night?" Isaac's laugh was rusty but genuine. "Is that the only reason you've been looking after this ornery cowboy, out of habit?" The teasing note in his voice was new, and it brought a flush to Cassidy's cheeks that had nothing to do with the crisp air. "Well, someone had to make sure you didn't waste away to nothing in your grief," his expression sobered. "I wasn't very grateful for it." "No," she agreed, "you weren't." "I am now," he said quietly. "Grateful, that is." Cassidy met his gaze, struck by the intensity she found there. "You're welcome." That night, as she prepared for sleep on her pallet in the main room, Cassidy found herself lingering over the small collection of wooden carvings Isaac had given her, now numbering a dozen, each more intricate than the last. She'd brought them from her cabin, unable to leave them behind when she came to care for him. "My father taught me," Isaac said from the bedroom doorway, startling her. He was leaning heavily on a crutch, his splinted legs still unwieldy. "You shouldn't be up without help," she admonished, quickly setting the figurines down. "Needed to stretch," he replied, hobbling to a chair by the fire. "You like them?" "The carvings," Cassidy nodded, picking up the meadowlark, the first he'd given her. "They're beautiful." "I didn't know you had such talent." "Haven't done it in years," he admitted. "Not since before the war, but when Thomas." He swallowed hard. "When he passed, I found myself picking up the knife again, helped quiet my mind." "Is that why you left them for me, to say thank you for the soup?" Isaac's eyes, reflecting the firelight, seemed to hold depth she'd never noticed before. "At first, maybe, then it became something more." "What do you mean?" He gestured to the carvings with his free hand. "Each one is something I noticed about you. The meadowlark you hum when you cook, did you know that? Always the same tune. The rabbit is quick and watchful like you when you're moving around the cabin. The fox, clever and determined." Cassidy's breath caught in her throat. All this time, he'd been watching her, seeing her, even when she thought herself invisible to him. "And this one?" she asked, picking up a small figure of a woman with her arms outstretched, her skirt seeming to flow in a frozen wind. Isaac's voice was soft. "That's you on the hill behind your cabin. I've watched you sometimes, standing there at sunset. You look free, like you could take flight any moment." The intimacy of the moment wrapped around them like a quilt on a winter night. Cassidy found herself moving closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. "I never meant to be a burden to you," Isaac said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You never were," she replied honestly, "even when you were at your most stubborn." His lips quirked in a half-smile. "Even when I wouldn't open the door, even then." The first snowfall came early that year, blanketing El Dorado in white before October's end. Dr. Jameson pronounced Isaac's leg healing well but warned that the cold months ahead would be painful as the bones knit fully together. "You should return to your own cabin, Miss Cooper," the doctor advised privately. "He's well enough to manage with daily visits now, and people are starting to talk." Cassidy felt her face grow warm. "Let them talk. I'm not leaving him alone with winter coming on, doctor." Jameson sighed, but there was a twinkle in his eye. "At least consider having Widow Palmer come stay as a chaperone, for propriety's sake." But Cassidy knew the elderly widow was needed by her daughter, who was expecting her third child any day. "I appreciate your concern, doctor, but I'm more worried about Isaac's well-being than my reputation." After the doctor left, Cassidy found Isaac watching her from the doorway of the bedroom, standing more steadily now on his crutch. "He's right, you know," he said quietly. "You should go home." "Are you trying to get rid of me, Isaac Quinn?" she asked lightly, though her heart suddenly felt leaden. "Never," he said with unexpected fierceness. "But I won't have your good name sullied because of me." Cassidy turned to face him fully. "Do you think I care what gossips say? Those same people who couldn't be bothered to check on you after Thomas died." "I didn't let them," Isaac reminded her. "Turned everyone away, except you." He took a halting step toward her. "You never gave up." "I'm stubborn that way," she said with a small smile. "Cassidy." The sound of her first name on his lips was new and sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the snow falling outside. "I can't ask you to stay." "You didn't ask," she pointed out. "I decided." Isaac's free hand reached for hers, his fingers calloused but gentle as they entwined with her own. "What if I want to ask you something else?" her heart stuttered. "Like what?" "Like whether you might consider staying permanently, not as my nurse or my cook or my caretaker." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But as my wife." Cassidy's eyes widened. "Isaac, I know it's sudden," he rushed on, "and I know I've been half a man these past months, but you've brought me back to life, Cassidy Cooper. As surely as if you'd reached into the grave and pulled me out." His grip on her hand tightened. "I don't deserve you, but if you'll have me, I swear I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of your love." Tears blurred her vision. "You already are," she whispered, and rose on tiptoe to press her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, both of them trembling with the newness of it. Then Isaac's arm came around her waist, drawing her closer, and the tenderness gave way to something deeper, a hunger long denied finally finding satisfaction. When they parted, breathless, Isaac rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" Cassidy laughed, joy bubbling up from some hidden spring within her. "Yes, Isaac Quinn. Yes." They were married on Christmas Day in the small white church of El Dorado, with snow falling gently outside and pine boughs festooning the simple altar. Isaac still walked with a slight limp, but he stood tall and straight as Cassidy came down the aisle to him, her mother's lace veil covering her radiant face. The townspeople filled the pews, their initial gossip having given way to genuine happiness for the couple who had overcome so much. Even crusty old Dr. Jameson was seen wiping away a tear as the vows were exchanged. "I think Thomas would have approved," Isaac whispered to his bride as they turned to face their well-wishers. "I know he would," Cassidy replied, squeezing his hand. "He always said you needed someone to look after you." Isaac's smile was warm enough to melt the winter snow. "He was right about that, though I think he'd be surprised it was the stubborn girl with the soup who finally got through to me." The reception was held at the town hall, a festive affair with music and dancing and more food than El Dorado had seen in one place since the previous year's harvest festival. Isaac danced with his new wife despite his leg, moving somewhat stiffly but with undeniable grace. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Quinn," Cassidy teased as he twirled her carefully. "Get used to it, Mrs. Quinn," he replied, his eyes twinkling. "I plan to surprise you for at least the next 50 years. They returned to Isaac's ranch that night, their ranch now the way lit by lanterns hanging from the porch that the hands had decorated with evergreen boughs. Inside, the fire was blazing, the cabin warm and welcoming. On the mantel, beside the wooden figurines Isaac had carved for her, stood a new one. A man and woman, hand in hand, their faces turned toward each other in an eternal moment of love. "When did you make this?" Cassidy asked, touched beyond words. "Been working on it for weeks," he admitted. "Had to hide it whenever you came near." She traced the delicate features with a fingertip. "It's perfect." Isaac came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing a kiss to the curve of her neck. "Not as perfect as you." As winter gave way to spring, the Quinn ranch flourished under the care of its new mistress. Cassidy planted a vegetable garden near the house and filled the once Spartan cabin with touches of color and comfort. Isaac's limp improved until it was barely noticeable, and he returned to full duties with a vigor that impressed even his most seasoned hands. But the most significant change was in Isaac himself. The grief that had once threatened to consume him still visited occasionally on Thomas's birthday, or when he found something that had belonged to his brother. But now, he shared those moments with Cassidy, allowing her to help bear the weight of remembrance. And in the evenings, they would often sit together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and purple, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "I never thought I'd find happiness again," Isaac confessed one such evening in late April, the air fragrant with new growth. "After Thomas died, I wanted to follow him." Cassidy turned in his embrace to look up at him. "I know, that's why I kept coming back." "I couldn't bear the thought of losing you too." He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "How did you know the soup would work?" she smiled, thinking of all the nights she'd stood at his door hoping. "I didn't. But I knew that grief can't survive long when faced with persistence and love." Isaac pressed his lips to her forehead, then to each cheek, and finally to her mouth in a kiss that spoke of promises kept and still to come. "I love you, Cassidy Quinn." "And I love you," she whispered against his lips. Inside the cabin, a pot of soup simmered on the stove, the same beef and barley that she'd first brought to his door nearly a year before. But now they would share it at their table together, the door between them finally and forever opened. In the years that followed, the Quinn ranch prospered, becoming one of the most successful in the county. Isaac and Cassidy welcomed 2 sons and a daughter, the eldest boy bearing the middle name Thomas in honor of the uncle he would never meet but whose story he would always know. And though life brought its share of hardships, as it always does, they faced each one together, drawing strength from the love that had begun with grief and persistence, and a simple pot of soup left on a doorstep until a broken heart was ready to heal.